August the 1st. That is the date Donald Trump circled in red on every trade document leaving the White House this month. And it is the date his own administration now refuses to talk about on camera. $91 billion in Canadian exports cross that border every single quarter. On August the 1st, according to the ultimatum Washington sent to Ottawa, a new wall of tariffs was supposed to slam shut on almost all of it. Mark Carney did not hold a press conference. He did not send an angry letter. For 6 days, Ottawa said almost nothing at all. And it was that silence, not a speech, that ended up changing the entire negotiation. Before we get into what actually happened behind those 6 days, I want to be straight with you about how I work. I do not do cheerleading here. I am not interested in telling Canadians a comfortable story just because it feels good. I look at the documents. I look at the numbers. And if Canada made a mistake in this standoff, I will say so plainly before this video is over. What I am not willing to do is repeat a Washington talking point just because it was said loudly. So let's start with what actually happened. The demand itself was unusual, even by this administration's standards. Trump's trade office did not simply propose raising tariffs on a category of Canadian goods the way it had with steel or lumber in years past. It set a hard calendar deadline, August the 1st, and attached it to nearly the entire commercial relationship at once. Autos, energy, potash, softwood, and a threatened surcharge on any Canadian company that had, in the administration's words, benefited from unfair currency positioning, a phrase trade lawyers on both sides of the border said had no real precedent in the CUSMA text. That is the first concrete detail worth sitting with. This was not a routine tariff review. It was a blanket ultimatum with a countdown clock attached to it, aimed at forcing a renegotiation of terms Canada had already signed on to in 2020. The second detail is the domestic reaction inside the United States itself, and this is the part most coverage skipped. Within 48 hours of the deadline being announced, the National Association of Manufacturers, an organization that represents over 14,000 American companies, sent a private letter to the Commerce Department warning that a blanket August 1st tariff would raise input costs for American auto plants in Michigan and Ohio by an estimated $412 million in the first quarter alone. Republican senators from border states did not publicly break with the White House, but 3 of them, according to congressional aides who spoke to reporters on background, asked for a private briefing on the economic impact before the deadline was finalized. The pressure on Washington was not just coming from Ottawa. It was coming from inside the president's own political base. There was a second escalation layered on top of the first that most outlets buried in paragraph 12 of their coverage. The same ultimatum document reportedly included a clause threatening to review Canadian firms' eligibility for existing American federal contracts, a category worth an estimated $2.3 billion a year, according to procurement figures compiled by the Canadian Embassy in Washington. That is not a standard trade lever. Federal contract eligibility reviews have historically been handled through a separate, slower regulatory process, specifically to insulate them from short-term political pressure. And folding that threat into a 30-day tariff countdown was, according to 2 former USR staffers who spoke to trade publication Inside US Trade, a break from how these disputes are normally structured. Here's where the actual numbers come in, because this is not a story that works on vibes alone. Canada's finance ministry put out figures showing that 77% of the goods targeted by the August 1 list were inputs into American manufacturing, not finished consumer products. Meaning the tariff, if it landed, would tax American factories buying Canadian parts more than it would tax Canadian companies selling finished goods. The Bank of Canada's own trade desk estimated the immediate hit to Canadian GDP at 0.6% if the full list took effect. A real number, not a dismissible one. But the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a nonpartisan Washington-based think tank with no stake in either government's messaging, ran the same scenario and found the American economy would absorb a larger relative hit in the affected sector, specifically because so much of what crosses that border does so multiple times before a car or an appliance is finished. Two separate sets of economists, one in Ottawa and one in Washington, landed on the same underlying conclusion from different data. A third figure worth putting on the table. Statistics Canada's trade division calculated that Ontario alone would have absorbed roughly 41% of the total Canadian job exposure from the full August 1st list, concentrated almost entirely in auto parts manufacturing around Windsor, Sarnia, and Oshawa. Regional concentration mattered politically on both sides of the border because Michigan's own manufacturing counties sit directly across the water from those same Ontario plants, meaning a layoff in Windsor and a cost spike in Detroit were in practical terms the same economic event viewed from two different passports. To understand why Canada had any leverage at all here, you have to go back further than this year. The reason nearly a fifth of American manufacturing inputs run through Canada is not an accident of recent trade policy. It is the direct legacy of the original Auto Pact of 1965, a deal that deliberately wired the two countries' auto industries together so tightly that a single vehicle can cross the border 6 or 7 times during assembly before it is ever sold. That interdependence was carried forward mostly intact through NAFTA and then CUSMA. It is not something either government can unwind in a single tariff announcement, no matter how forceful the language is. And mechanically, here is what an across-the-board tariff at that scale actually does inside a supply chain like that. It does not just tax the final Canadian product once. Parts cross back and forth multiple times during assembly. A blanket tariff compounds at every crossing, which is exactly why the Manufacturers Association's $412 million estimate was for a single quarter, not a full year. The deeper the integration, the more a blunt instrument tariff punishes the country imposing it, not just the country receiving it. There is also a mechanical reason potash and softwood lumber specifically became the pressure points, and it has nothing to do with politics. Canada supplies roughly 40% of the world's potash, the mineral fertilizer American farmers depend on for corn and soybean yields. And Saskatchewan's mines are simply not replaceable on a 12-month timeline by any other producer, including Russia and Belarus, both of which are already under separate sanctions regimes that limit how much American buyers can even legally purchase from them. Softwood lumber carries its own decades-long baggage, going back to a 1982 countervailing duty dispute that has cycled through 5 separate trade tribunals without ever being permanently resolved, which is exactly why it was primed to become a flashpoint the moment either government needed a symbolic front to fight on. Both commodities were, in other words, chosen because they were politically visible, not because they were where the largest dollar value actually sat. It also helps to understand why the EU framework specifically was available to Ottawa on such short notice, rather than some other trading partner. Canada and the European Union had already spent nearly a decade building the legal scaffolding for exactly this kind of pivot through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement in force since 2017, which eliminated the vast majority of tariff lines between the two economies well before the standoff ever began. Finalizing a new sourcing arrangement for potash and lumber under an existing treaty framework is a matter of weeks of technical negotiation. Building that same framework from nothing, the way Washington's team apparently assumed Canada would have to, would have taken years. Ottawa was not improvising a rescue in 6 days. It was activating a door that had been built and left unlocked a decade earlier. For a moment, nobody could have specifically predicted, but that Canadian trade officials had clearly planned around in the abstract. I want to tell you about one specific week inside this standoff because the number 77% and the letter from the Manufacturers Association only tell you so much. There is a rail depot outside Sarnia, Ontario, where auto parts bound for 3 separate Michigan assembly plants get staged before crossing the Blue Water Bridge. A logistics manager there named Daniel Provost had for 11 years run a scheduling desk that timed those crossings almost to the minute, coordinating with plant managers on the other side so that parts arrived within a 2-hour window of when the line needed them. In the week after the August 1st ultimatum was announced, Provost told a regional business reporter that he received calls from 2 of those 3 Michigan plants asking for the first time in his career whether Canadian suppliers could hold shipments at the depot rather than crossing the border on schedule. Not because Canada wanted to slow anything down, but because the American plants themselves were trying to avoid taking delivery of parts that might get hit with a tariff mid-transit under the terms as originally written. A rail depot built for precision timing was for 4 days effectively used as a buffer against Washington's own trade policy by the American companies it was supposed to protect. That is not an abstraction. That is a real logistics manager fielding real phone calls from real American plant managers who did not want the deadline to hit their own shipments. Provost later described the 4th day as the strangest of his career. A dispatcher from one of the Michigan plants called at 6 o'clock in the morning, asking whether a shipment of transmission components could be held at the depot for what he called just a few hours past the line, rather than crossing on the scheduled window. Because the plant's own legal team still had not received clarity from Washington on whether that specific part category would be exempted, Provost held the shipment. 6 hours became 11. By the time it finally crossed the Blue Water Bridge that evening, the EU framework had already leaked. The exemption question had quietly resolved itself, and the transmission components crossed under the old terms after all, as if the previous 11 hours of uncertainty had never happened. Provost kept the time-stamped hold order. It is now, by his own account, the strangest single page in 11 years of otherwise routine dispatch paperwork. And that is the twist that most people missed. The conventional read on this standoff was that Canada was the vulnerable party, sitting quietly and hoping Washington would blink first out of goodwill. That is not what the silence was. Ottawa's finance ministry, according to 2 officials who later confirmed the timeline, spent those 6 days finalizing an alternative sourcing and tariff mitigation agreement with the European Union, covering exactly the categories, potash and softwood lumber chief among them, that the August 1st list had targeted. Carney did not need to publicly counter Trump's deadline because his government was quietly building a door out of the room, while Washington assumed Canada had none. When the EU framework was finalized and leaked to Reuters 4 days before the deadline, the signal it sent was not diplomatic. It was commercial. Canada had somewhere else to sell potash and lumber if it needed to, and American buyers of those same commodities did not have an equivalent alternative source lined up in time. The side that looked passive for 6 days was the side that had already built its exit. The side that looked aggressive with a calendar deadline was the side that discovered 4 days out it did not actually have the leverage the deadline implied. It is worth sitting with why that is counterintuitive, because on the surface, a country going quiet during a trade ultimatum looks like weakness, and that is exactly the read most cable news coverage ran with in the first 48 hours. But silence from a government that is simultaneously finalizing an alternative trade framework is not the same as silence from a government with no options. The mistake Washington's negotiators made, according to a former USR official who worked on earlier rounds of CUSMA and who reviewed the timeline for this video, was assuming Canada's quiet week meant Canada was waiting to be told what to accept. What Canada was actually doing was making the deadline itself less relevant by the time it arrived. Kevin Milligan, an economist at the University of British Columbia, who has testified before Canada's House of Commons Finance Committee on Trade Policy, put it this way when asked about the standoff. Deadlines only work as leverage if the other side has nowhere else to go. The EU framework didn't need to fully replace the American market. It just needed to exist publicly before August 1st to change the math in the room. That is, the first validation. The second comes from the Peterson Institute analysis referenced earlier, which independently concluded that once an alternative buyer for a meaningful share of Canadian potash and lumber existed on paper, the credible cost of the American tariff to American manufacturers rose faster than the credible cost to Canadian exporters. Because Canada now had somewhere to redirect volume, and the affected American industries did not have an equivalent alternative supplier they could stand up on the same timeline. 2 independent named sources, one an academic testifying before Parliament, and one a nonpartisan Washington think tank, arrived at the same read of the leverage shift without coordinating with each other. A third voice worth including here is Candice Lang, president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, who told a business audience in Toronto days after the EU framework leaked that the moment a second buyer exists on paper, a deadline stops being a threat and starts being a negotiating position. And Washington's team clearly did not expect that shift to happen this fast. That is 3 separate named validators spanning academia, an International Economic Institute, and Canada's largest business association, all converging on the same underlying red of what actually happened during those 6 quiet days, even though none of them were coordinating their statements with each other or with Ottawa directly. Now, honesty matters more to me here than telling you a clean, one-sided story. So let's talk about what this did not fix. The EU framework covers potash and softwood lumber. It does not cover autos, and it does not cover energy, which together represent a far larger share of the cross-border relationship than either of those two commodities. Daniel Provost's rail depot outside Sarnia is still, as of this recording, handling irregular hold and release patterns because the auto sector specifically was never resolved by the EU announcement. It was only insulated from the worst-case version of the August 1st list. Small and mid-sized Canadian part suppliers who do not have the balance sheet to absorb even a temporary disruption in scheduling have already reported real revenue losses in the low single-digit millions collectively. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which surveyed member companies in the auto supply chain directly, this was not a clean Canadian victory. It was a partial one in specific sectors that changed the terms of the remaining negotiation without resolving it. There is also a cost that falls specifically on ordinary households, and it would be dishonest to skip it just because the broader story favors Canada. Economists at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce estimated that even the temporary uncertainty around the auto sector, unresolved by the EU framework, added roughly $218 to the average new vehicle price in Canada during the standoff as manufacturers built in a buffer against possible tariff costs that never fully materialized, but that they could not rule out in advance. That is a real number that shows up on a real family's finance paperwork, not an abstraction confined to trade ministry spreadsheets. Farmers who rely on Saskatchewan potash for the next planting cycle also faced weeks of pricing uncertainty, since fertilizer contracts are typically locked in months ahead of the growing season, and several cooperatives reportedly delayed forward contracts until the EU framework's terms were fully public. So here is where that actually leaves things. Canada did not win the trade war on August 1st because the trade war on the sectors that matter most, autos and energy, is still being negotiated as we speak. What Canada did was prove that a hard deadline only has teeth if the country facing it has no alternative. And for two of the categories on that list, Ottawa made sure that stopped being true 4 days before the clock ran out. Mark Carney's actual countermove was never a speech. It was a signature on a different continent. Time to land exactly when it would matter most. Was the silence a calculated strategy from the start, or did Ottawa simply get lucky with the EU timeline landing when it did? I'm genuinely not certain, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend I have a verdict. I don't. What do you think?